Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about understanding uncleanness. Whenever I was getting into learning about the Torah, I realized there were issues of clean and unclean. Now, I already knew about certain animals being unclean, for instance, but there was something else going on beyond this, and it wasn't entirely clear at first. So in this video, we're going to be looking at issues of clean and unclean, first in a more general sense, and then getting into the specifics of it. So there are three things we're going to look at. There are clean and unclean animals, clean and unclean people, and clean and unclean things. Now, for the purposes of learning this, we need to make a distinction between clean and unclean animals and clean and unclean people and things. That the issue of animals is fairly distinct when compared with the other two categories. So first, in addressing unclean animals. All animals that are clean are always clean, and all animals that are unclean are always unclean. Whether an animal is clean or unclean is determined by the animal's type, by the animal's anatomy typically. So you can look at Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 for more on this, but essentially it comes down to certain types of animals based upon their anatomy or because they are included in a certain list, that all of those animals of that type are either clean or unclean. So we aren't going to have, for example, a cow that is normally a clean animal. We're not going to find an unclean cow. And the same thing for a pig. We're not going to find a clean pig. So in considering that, clean animals are always clean and unclean animals are always unclean. So when we get into the issues of people and things, it is a different story because the natural state is that people and things are clean. But certain circumstances and events cause people or things to become unclean. So normally, a person is going to be clean. And just for example, say they're walking through a field and they suddenly trip over something and then they realize that that was a dead, unclean animal that they just touched, they tripped over. And so that person that was clean now has become unclean because of that action, because of that circumstance or event. Now, people and things, at least for some things, can become clean again through another action or through another event. And this depends upon the specifics of that uncleanness. So the normal state of people and things is clean, and then they become unclean through actions or through events, and then usually they can become clean again through some other action or event. One thing to recognize is that clean and unclean are not always issues of right and wrong. So just because a person does something that causes the person to become unclean does not mean that they have violated any commands. Now, there are some commands that violating the command causes a person to also become unclean. But this is not the general rule. So for example, a person could touch the carcass of an unclean animal, an unclean beast, and this is prohibited. There is a command that tells us to not touch their carcasses. And so that would be a violation of the command, and the person would also become unclean. However, a person could have sex and not violate any of the commands in the process, and that person would also become unclean. This does not mean that they've done anything wrong, but that action, that event, caused them to become unclean. So we have to separate clean and unclean from the issue of right and wrong. There are some correlations, but as the general rule, becoming unclean does not mean a person violated a command. And most of these issues of clean and unclean, they relate to the tabernacle. They relate to the tent of meeting, the house of Elohim, such as we see in Leviticus 15:31. You shall separate sons of Israel from their uncleanness, and they shall not die in their uncleanness, in their defiling my tabernacle, which is in their midst. So we are separating between clean and unclean, not just with animals, but with the uncleanness of people and the uncleanness of things, so that we are not dying in our uncleanness. This is connected, of course, with defiling his tabernacle. So we have clean and unclean animals, and we have clean and unclean people, and we have clean and unclean things. Clean and unclean with animals is determined by the animal's type, by the animal's anatomy. A clean animal is always clean, an unclean animal is always unclean. And we have clean and unclean people and things. And these things are determined to be unclean because of actions or circumstances. And so what are some of those actions or circumstances that cause people to become unclean? As mentioned, touching the carcass of an unclean animal causes someone to become unclean. Touching or moving the carcass of a clean animal that dies. So say a clean animal has died from some means other than being slaughtered. The animal was not killed, it just up and died. So touching or moving such a carcass causes a person to become unclean. Eating from a clean animal that dies, or eating from a clean animal that was preyed upon, that was attacked by another animal. A woman giving birth to a male child shall be unclean 7 days. A woman giving birth to a female child shall be unclean for 2 weeks. Also, different types of leprosy or scourge cause uncleanness. And entering in or eating in or lying in a closed up scourged house. So there is a house that has been afflicted with scourge and the priest has declared it to be unclean and has closed it up. And so if someone's entering in or they're eating or lying in that house, he is becoming unclean. Flowing from the flesh causes uncleanness, whether the flow is running or whether it has been sealed off or bandaged. Touching or carrying the bed, seat, or saddle of a flowing person. Touching the flesh of a flowing person. Being touched by a flowing person that didn't wash his hands first. Or being spat on by a flowing person. All of these things cause uncleanness. If a man's seed goes forth, it causes uncleanness. If a man and a woman are lying together and seed goes forth, they are both unclean. A woman's period, she has 7 days of separation, beginning with the beginning of the period. Touching a woman during her separation causes uncleanness. A man lying with a woman and her separation is on him causes uncleanness. And also, this is something that's forbidden otherwise. It is a violation of a command. A woman flowing blood apart from her normal period becomes unclean. Touching the bed or the seat of a woman during her separation causes uncleanness. And there are also issues of becoming unclean by soul or becoming unclean by the dead. And this is a slightly separate issue. It's a different kind of uncleanness. If a person touches the dead, he becomes unclean for 7 days. If a person touches the dead or a slain person in the field, human bones or graves, he becomes unclean for 7 days. And one coming into a tent that a person died in, or anyone that was in it, they become unclean for 7 days. So what does it affect if a person is unclean? An unclean person is cut from the people if he is eating from the peace offerings while unclean. And as we saw, the people are to separate from uncleanness so they do not die in defiling his tabernacle. And the priest shall not near to or eat from the holy things while he is unclean. And in the camp, the unclean people are being sent out of the camp so they do not defile where he tabernacles in the midst of. And a soldier that becomes unclean by an occurrence of the night goes outside the camp. And the leper or the scourged person must dress a certain way, and he must call unclean, unclean, and he must live outside the camp while he is afflicted in this way. And if a person is unclean by the dead, if the person was a Nazirite, it defiles his vow. And a person unclean by the dead is not able to keep the Passover normally. And also, it defiles the tabernacle. So the normal state of people is that they are clean. And then an action is done, or an event takes place, and this causes them to become unclean. So we saw instances like touching a dead, unclean animal, or touching a person that has a flow, or becoming afflicted with leprosy or the scourge. Those sorts of things cause a person to become unclean. And then there is a particular procedure to become clean again. Either they have to wait until evening in some cases, or they have to wash their clothes and or their body in order to become clean again. Except in certain cases, there are additional procedures as we saw. So how does the issue of unclean things work? We looked at a few of those examples in the midst of this because people were interacting with unclean things. But what are the specific laws regarding unclean things? How do objects become unclean? Dead creeping things, falling onto them or into the vessel with them. So we might think of rodents or reptiles dying and falling into a vessel or something along those lines, falling onto an object. That causes the object typically to become unclean. Or if an article of cloth or leather is affected by scourge, that causes the object to become unclean. Or everything in the house, when the priest announces that the house is scourged, becomes unclean. Now, one interesting thing about this is if you look at the passage, it basically says that the priest declaring it as unclean is what makes it unclean. And it says to remove the things from the house before the priest comes so that they don't become unclean. So the priest announcing the house is scourged causes the contents of the house to become unclean. And also, the bed, seat, or saddle of a flowing person becomes unclean. Or if a man's seed is on cloth or leather, it causes that to become unclean. And that which a woman is lying or sitting on during her separation or during her abnormal bleeding becomes unclean. And open vessels which were not bound by twine in the tent of one dying are unclean. And what does an unclean object affect? Now, obviously it depends upon the type of object, and we saw examples that touching certain objects causes uncleanness in a person, or being in a scourged house causes uncleanness in a person. And there is also the issue of Leviticus 7:19. This is in reference to the peace offering. And the flesh which shall touch in all uncleanness, it shall not be eaten, it shall be incinerated in fire. So the flesh of the peace offering, if it contacts uncleanness, it is to be burned up. So certain kinds of unclean objects cause uncleanness in a person, and they can also cause sacrifices to be defiled. These are the issues of clean and unclean. There are clean and unclean animals, which a clean animal is always clean, an unclean animal is always unclean. And it is determined by the animal's anatomy or by the animal's type. And we are commanded to not eat from the flesh of unclean animals. And also there are clean and unclean people and clean and unclean things. A person or a thing, its normal state is to be clean. But there are certain actions or certain circumstances that cause uncleanness. Some of these are violations of commands. Some of them are not. And generally, there are procedures to make the person or to make the thing clean again, except in some cases where the thing must be destroyed. Articles of scratch and other things that cannot be cleansed, they must be destroyed. And in general, these issues of clean and unclean connect with the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the house of Elohim. That Elohim does not want us to be bringing our defilement to his house. And we don't want to be defiling the holy things at his house, the tent of meeting. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out some of my other videos on other Torah issues, and be sure that you stay in touch so we can continue this discussion. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Shalom.